Welcome to the first session of Difficult Discussions. Difficult Discussions is paired, starting this year, is paired on a monthly basis with Critical Conversations on the same topic. The next Critical Conversation, which will be on Tuesday, September 28th, is with Eric Kaufman of the Birkbeck College at the University of London. He is an internationally known political scientist and demographer. We'll be talking his book about populism and white politics and what in the book called White Shift. So it'd be a slightly different take. Explain kind of a little bit how we operate here. We've gone to this because Critical Conversations, which we've done for the last 12 months, is primarily a kind of academic talking heads with people allowed to come in and ask questions or maybe make comments here. But we established Difficult Conversations. We don't want this academic talking heads. We want full participation for the public. So you might say this is a true experiment in what we call the public intellectual enterprise. And so it is going to be more collaborative and more communicative, you might say, among participants. You've all kind of got the ground rules for how we're going to function. I won't introduce everybody right now, except our main guests. Those who will be respondents are member of the Whitestone Publications staff. Whitestone Publications is a 5013 nonprofit corporation registered in the state of Colorado that has been publishing two major electronic journals, one for over 20 years and the other one for several years, the Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory and the new Polis. And the staff of Whitestone Publications is here with us to respond. They have different roles. Many of them, in fact, most of them are in graduate programs at the University of Denver. So this venture is also a partnership with the College of Arts and Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Denver. In other words, they pay the bills and we supply the labor. So, what other public personalities, might be in hand here. So we really, our guests who I'm going to introduce right now will be giving about a 5-minute, presentation or saying remarks about their answer to the prompt about critical race theory in evangelicalism. What is it and what does it have to do with evangelicalism, Christian evangelicalism at all? And after they've finished delivering their remarks, our staff, or our editorial team, as we prefer to call them, will be giving their own responses, promptings, maybe trying to shift the conversation, maybe objecting, but we don't want, this is not cable television, so we don't want people fighting with each other. And to make sure things don't get too bloody or brawly, I've invited a former MA student from the University of Denver and a good friend of mine who's worn many hats, whose name is John Zvoinovich. We call him the Z-Man because I've known him now for over 25 years and I still can't spell his name. But I know how to pronounce it at least. You can see it, Zivojinovic. I sometimes use the mnemonic voice to say Gino Vino Vic, but sounds kind of like the Sopranos, doesn't it? But anyway, it's pronounced John Zvoinovich. Well, what can I say? Just praise him to the sky, but just let me say a little bit about who he is, and then I'll get into introducing guests. So John received his PhD from Nova Southeastern University in the social sciences, specifically, and this is why I invited him, conflict analysis and resolution. His first master's was from Moody Theological Seminary, and a second from the University of Denver, where he took courses, he says, with Dr. Rashke. He got a master's degree in philosophy. He, by the way, the first course he sat in on was Nietzsche, in which I played the madman in The Death of God. And that's kind of been an ongoing tradition. So John keeps bringing that up, but we will have no madmen with lanterns in this particular conversation. He spent 30 years in pastoral ministry, and he's now a lead philosophy instructor for the Colorado Community College system online. Okay, you want to say anything else about yourself, John? You know, other than he's,
I think that says it.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter when we're online, but he's big, you know, and if you see him up front, he's in person. And if you're in Denver, just don't mess with him, okay? So let me go down our other three guests. We had invited two other people. One had to cancel at the last minute because they're in a cabin in Colorado that has, their internet is not working. We know how that is. We tried to get some other people to get kind of different voices, but we weren't able to secure them this time. So let me start with somebody who's not got a University of Denver connection here anyway, and that is Professor Soong-Chan Ra. Did I pronounce that correctly? Soong-Chan
really
Ra?
really good for a non-Korean. Yes.
Great. Okay. He's Robert Boyd Munger Professor of Evangelism at Fuller Theological Seminary. He just joined their faculty starting this month, I think, right? So, or last month. He holds a PhD from Duke Divinity School and has authored or co-authored over half a dozen and many award-winning books, including The Next Evangelism, Mixed Evangelicalism, Freeing the Church from Western Cultural Captivity, and then Many Colors, Cultural Intelligence for a Changing Church, Prophetic Lament, A Call for Justice in Troubled Times, and Return to Justice, 6 movements that reignited our contemporary evangelical conscience, and then finally Unsettling Truth, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery, which interestingly enough was the topic of our first critical conversation last year. He's also a pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Our next guest is Scott Coley. I can pronounce that. He's a lecturer in philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. That's in Maryland, right, Scott? Yeah, he's the author of a not yet published book, which looks really interesting to me, though, and it's relevant, along with several articles he's published in philosophy journals. With the book that interests me is called After the Culture War, Justice, Politics, and American Evangelicalism. He has a PhD from Purdue University. And finally, Jason Alvis, who's also our European editor and kind of our man in Bremen, you know, or our man in the backwoods, the Redneck part of Germany. Is that fair? He's a lecturer in philosophy and at the University of Vienna and co-principal of a major international grant project on, I couldn't remember exactly the title, Jason. Can you tell me the title of your grant project that I've been involved in?
Yeah, the current one is called Revenge of the Sacred, Phenomenology, the Ends of Christianity in Europe.
Yeah,
That's
great. And he's the author of Marion and Derrida on the Gift of Desire, which is actually his doctoral dissertation, which he published. And he was a doctoral student under a guy, this weird guy that is probably beyond, well, he is actually on this conversation, Rashka or something like that. He worked it under that. But then he published it with, was that Routledge you published it with? Yeah, so yeah, Springer, yeah. So very interesting book. And then French Phenomenology and the Theological Turn, which is more recent full book. And that's with Indiana University Press. And he holds a PhD from the University of Denver under this guy, Roshkin. So our editorial team, I'm not going to introduce you now. I'll let you introduce yourself when you start and say a few words about you. Now we'll get into the discussions. By the way, some of you who are guests have written statements. We will offer these statements, and we will put them online. If you haven't prepared anything, that's okay. You can write one later, or we can just take the transcript to whatever you say and try to edit with that. John, when we get to actually these people interacting with each other, that's when you need to bring down the hammer, okay? And also feel free to offer, as one of the respondents, your own, your own views as well. Or you can do it right after all our guests have made their statements. Does that sound fair? Okay.
Sure.
Great. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to stop chatting because my mouth is getting dry. So we'll, if you don't mind, I'll just start with the people in the order that I introduce people. So Soong-Chan, is that how you like to be addressed?
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Just so you know, gentlemen, I'm going to start a clock for 5 minutes. When you're down to 1 minute, I'm going to just say 1 minute, just so you have an idea. I'll try not to be too intrusive, but I want to make you aware. We don't want to go on and on and on and on. We want to make sure everybody gets a chance to talk. Okay, Soong-Chan.
Thank you. I'll get right to it. I want to talk about the two terms that we are engaging in and a sharper definition, because part of the challenge in this conversation is, as I think many of you are aware of already, a conflation or a confusion around both of these terms, evangelicalism and critical race theory. So I'll begin with actually evangelicalism and the confusion around this term as in how it is popularly used and how it should be maybe more specifically used, and that there is not just an evangelicalism, but there are multiple variations and expressions of evangelicalism. Historian Don Dayton has been really good at trying to expand evangelicalism beyond some of the more limiting definitions that have been used both historically and sociologically. Evangelicalism has multiple threads, and I'm going to just highlight a few of them because of their impact on this particular topic. The most noticeable one or notable one that folks reference back to is a fundamentalism that is noted in evangelicalism. And this goes back to things like the Scopes trial and the response to the Scopes trial, a kind of a fundamentalism of faith, that there are these 5 fundamentals that are very important to the framing of faith. That group, the fundamentalist evangelicals, tend to be have a what I would call a truth-possessed approach to both theology and politics, as in, I own this truth within the bounded set of kind of ideas that I have, and therefore those outside of that is unacceptable and to be rejected. So this is where you get some of the kind of ethos of culture warrior. Fundamentalists would view the world as, I hold these truths. These are very important, foundational, fundamental truths of my faith, and therefore anything outside of that needs to be rejected. And you can see how a fundamentalist evangelical would view something like critical race theory as someone outside of the appropriate boundaries, and therefore reject it, even maybe without considering what that means, but just kind of say, that is not within my set boundaries. These are not the fundamentals of my faith. A couple of other threads that are helpful to understand would be the Reformed thread and the Pentecostal thread. And these are also highly steeped in a theological framework of truth possessed, a theological framework of bounded set. And so the idea of these ideas that come from outside of that community would in many ways be obviously held in suspicion, but oftentimes just kind of categorically rejected, such as the theory of evolution by fundamentalists in the 1920s, in the early half of the 20th century, and such as critical race theory in the 21st century by those from the fundamentalist, Reformed, and Pentecostal threads. What's interesting to me, though, is that there are a couple of other threads that have a different relationship with these other threads. So one would be the group that emerges in the 1970s and 1980s, the neo-evangelicals, and they come from all these different spaces. So they might be coming from a fundamentalist, maybe Southern Baptist space denominationally, or they might be coming from a Reform, maybe Presbyterian denominational space, or Pentecostal AOG space. But they kind of converge in the 70s around this neo-evangelical space. And a lot of the neo-evangelical space is hyper-pragmatic. This is where you get things like the church growth movement, the seeker-sensitive churches, the mega churches, the kind of the conferences that and the literature that revolves around this neo-evangelicalism of the 1970s. This is when neo-evangelicalism has kind of this suspicious, ambivalent, ambiguous relationship with culture and with politics. Many of the neo-evangelicals actually don't get involved in politics. So if you think about the neo-evangelical names of the last 20 years, you think of the Rick Warrens and the Bill Hybels and the Tim Kellers. They tend to be, by and large, apolitical. They don't like have these kind of culture warrior mentality. What's interesting to me is that you can kind of say, okay, fundamentalists, reformists, Pentecostals will have an antagonistic kind of almost a knee-jerk reaction against something like critical race theory, but it has also been neo-evangelicals who have also been kind of antagonistic to critical race theory as well. So that's something that needs to be kind of explored, as to say, did the neo-evangelicals adapt some of the culture warrior, and I would agree, the culture warrior stance that fundamentalists, reformers, and Pentecostals would be more akin to. The fifth group is progressive evangelicals, and this is the group that would actually look at critical race theory in a favorable light and see that approach to understanding the world around them as a help rather than a distraction or a negative to their understanding of society. I don't know how much time I have, but I thought I would talk a little bit about the term.
Sorry.
I'm maxed out. Okay. I didn't get to the critical race theory part, but just as a quick aside, it clearly, as already others are going to mention, it is clearly a misunderstanding of what critical race theory is. So if you talk to any of these evangelical, neo-evangelical, doesn't matter the thread almost, if you ask them to define critical race theory, that definition will be all over the map. And it really doesn't actually line up with what critical race theory, the academic discipline, the actual specific discipline it is. It doesn't match up to that at all. So again, there's kind of a categorical rejection, and a lot of that comes from the evangelical ethos and worldview.
Okay, thank you.
I guess Scott next.
Okay, thank you. So my training is in analytic philosophy. I'm a recovering analytic philosopher, I guess, but I've only come so far. So I've written out my remarks. I hope that's okay. So I think there are at least three distinct things that the term critical race theory picks out. Given the subject of today's conversation, I'll start by highlighting and dismissing what we might call CRT in the popular evangelical imagination, sort of picking up where we left off there, right? And I think that this CRT in the popular evangelical imagination has become something of a proxy battle in the religious rights culture war. In some conservative evangelical circles, for example, CRT includes any discussion of race that links racially disparate outcomes to the facts of American history or problematic institutional arrangements. Here's an example of how this plays out. Some evangelicals talk as though the concept of systemic racism is a creature of CRT, and they define CRT strictly in terms of theorizing about racist attitudes. So according to this paradigm, systemic racism is a contrivance of critical race theorists who wish to assert the ubiquity of racial prejudice among white Americans. An assertion that rings false to white evangelicals who reflect on their own attitudes and think to themselves, well, I'm not racist, so systemic racism can't be real, right? And then you add in the assertion that CRT has a theoretical connection to Marxism or cultural Marxism, and the gestalt that emerges is that systemic racism is a myth, perhaps even a conspiracy theory, in the language of one erstwhile Newsweek column, originating in the minds of godless Marxists who say defamatory things about white people in America in an effort to desecrate the West's intellectual inheritance. It's really a remarkable sleight of hand, actually, by identifying the concept of systemic racism with a group of radical Marxists who theorize about the preponderance of racist attitudes. white evangelicals can dismiss all claims of systemic racism without addressing a single substantive fact about the existence or prevalence of racialized institutional injustice, like, racial disparities in wealth, income, and educational opportunity that are clearly rooted in discriminatory housing policies, which remained officially in force until 1968, and unofficially in force, of course, well after that. So having discarded the caricature of CRT that we find in the popular evangelical imagination, I think two spheres of application for this term, critical race theory, stand out by way of highlighting the potential usefulness of critical race theory to evangelical Christianity, back to sort of the original question. So one area of application has to do with psychology, reflecting on attitudes about race and how race is conceptualized and so forth. I'm least familiar with that aspect of CRT, so I'll let others comment on that. The other major concern of CRT is institutions, including the domain of overlap between institutional and psychological analyses, where we find questions of ideology. In particular, features of human cognition, which lead us to embrace myths and propaganda that legitimize unjust social hierarchies. And that, I think, is the source of much resistance to CRT among white evangelicals. I don't know what to say about whether CRT specifically is the most fruitful resource for Christian reflection on institutional justice or ideology. Maybe, maybe not. But we need something, because for about 50 years, the religious right has been using the resources of Christian theology to underwrite the legitimizing myth that wealth, income, and opportunity in the US are allocated justly, according to merit. And many on the Christian right have lost the ability to differentiate their Christian faith from the mythology that their faith has been used to prop up, which is to say, many on the Christian right have become white Christian nationalists. I do think that CRT, particularly in the hands of Christians, furnishes us with resources to problematize white Christian nationalism. And I think that's why white Christian nationalists are so terrified of critical race theory. And at the moment, I see anything that poses a threat to white Christian nationalism as good for Christians and good for America. The end. I don't know how much time I have left, but.
I'll tell you, you have 40 seconds.
40 seconds. All right, well, thank you for inviting me to participate. That's all I have to say for now.
Good. Who's next, Carl?
Jason?
I'm going to take advantage of those 40 seconds, Scott. So thank you.
I yield my time to the gentleman.
If I could have it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
The gentleman in Germany. Great. Well, as has already been mentioned by Carl, yeah, I'm here in Germany. So I have a different perspective on the problems that you all are dealing with over there. I have more of an armchair perspective than it is a real boots on the ground perspective. But I do have some observations from where I'm sitting. And there are many problems that critical race theory, as I see it, addresses here in Germany. We have very similar problems, not the same, but very similar. So first, I want to say just a tiny bit about what critical race theory is. I mean, it has its roots, I would say, first of all, in one of the widest movements in philosophy ever. Hear me out on this. I mean, it's despite this word critical, its roots are in one of the most optimistic philosophical movements in recent history, and critical theory. It's rooted in a movement in Germany, especially from the 40s up until the late 60s, of male academic white elite Germans who really tried to take the Kantian Enlightenment as seriously as ever, and tried to give every person a seat at the table, exposing ideologies of power. And in this sense, they're trying to respond in the wake of Auschwitz and the genocide of Jewish peoples, a la racism in Germany. So some might even call this movement critical theory, colonial guilt at its very best. Or, you know, as Horkheimer, one of the founders of critical theory, once put it, critical theory seeks the emancipation of human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. Now, there's a number of thinkers that have influenced critical theory and have been built out of critical theory, from Gramsci through Derrida, Foucault, Frantz Fanon. and many others, but it gained its namesake in the 70s through law scholars, of all people, who were coming to read critical theorists, especially of this European ilk, and attempted to take seriously these philosophical problems of emancipation and rationality, but also to look at the decline or the retreat of some of the advancements that have been made in the civil rights era, and in terms of race. So I would say critical race theory is by no means in full agreement with all the attackers that pin it for, as Scott has already mentioned quite well, and I don't really need to say much more about that, about this straw man of critical race theory as it gets lumped into a host of other problems with wokeness and social justice and so on. But it is something that has had a major impact on affirmative action, practical law as it's being practiced today, and it is something that's drawing great attention. So I want to say something really quick about its usefulness for Christian evangelicals. That was one of the parts of the question in the prompt. How is it useful? So, you know, as a good Baptist, I have three points. It's helpful for reaching in, reaching up, and reaching out. And we're talking now very specifically about the church. How can the church use critical race theory? First, reaching out. It's a silver platter for missional engagement. If churches want to be true to their name of evangelizing some good news, there's an incredible opportunity in critical race theory. It provides the opportunity to bring other people in and to draw others into emancipation. And what more of a theological topic, soteriological topic of atonement and reconciliation than emancipation? And critical race theory helps us think more closely about emancipation. Point two, reaching in. Critical race theory provides opportunities for institutional investigation. So one of the great thinkers of critical race theory, James Baldwin, philosopher, argued over half a century ago, we need to look at the material facts. Don't just look at the abstract beliefs of communities, but look at the material facts of how people live their lives. What do they spend their money on? Look at their purchase history, this sort of thing. Take a look at your own purchase history and see if those material facts line up with your actual beliefs. This is a truth we can learn from critical race theory, and it's something that helps us look at the church, look at our individual churches, and see if there's anything dangerously naive about how we relate with other peoples, and especially peoples that are different from us, and how we pin them to be quite different from us. And then the third is reaching up. It helps us develop solidarity, not division. This is one concern that many hold about critical race theory, that it creates an us versus them, an us, the minority populations versus them, the white majority populations. It sets this kind of dynamic up. And this critique of critical race theory, it's not simply that way. I'll say that quite simply. It's not just directed against white people. It's much deeper than that. As J. Cameron Carter, the black theologian, once put it so brilliantly, in my opinion, racism is killing white people softly with what he called a white melancholy. It's something that we see today, and a certain sadness of this major division that we're experiencing today. So in the sense that critical race theory can give us a new way to experience God, and that's why third point, reaching up, to experience God and experience unification, solidarity with God and with other people. And if you look at this very word atonement, it means at one-ment. So atonement with God also means at one-ment with brothers and sisters and other persons in the body of Christ. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Carl?
John, do you want to say something now yourself?
Well, what I find fascinating is critical race theory, and again, we have the academics, and I'm more of a pragmatist personally, and so I'm in a different league. But I do remember that when I was a senior pastor and I asked an African American to join our preaching team, and again, it's not because he was black, but it was because he was a really good communicator. And I just remember some of the people in the congregation, not most of the people loved it, thought it was great, but it really stretched them. I mean, it really pushed their, concept and their whole thing. And so I think that whole thing about where faith and culture kind of gets interwoven, that, I believe our second speaker was Scott was talking about. I think there's some real things there that CRT has an opportunity for us. I think that was also is to institutional examination. I think there's a huge opportunity to examine what are we doing, why are we doing it, what's the value, what's the benefit, who are we protecting, and just asking really hard questions. And so to me, anything in culture that can help us evaluate is a win. And so I'm an advocate of that. But again, I thought everybody did a great job.
All right, great. All right, and John, I'm not moderating here. I'm just introducing people. So when we start engaging each other, you turn it over to you. But so we'll start with our staff, and I want to first ask Joshua Ramos, who's the special projects editor for Whitestone Publications, who's actually, I can tell you, just full disclosure, he and Jason were both PhD students of mine at the same time. But actually, I know Josh go all the way back when we were part of a little postmodern church together in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so, Josh, what do you want to start off by saying something about this issue?
Hi. Yes, thank you very much for having me on board. And I guess everybody everything that was just said was brilliant, and I guess I'll try to add something that I don't have much more to add, but I guess some of my thoughts are just finally just to focus on the subject and what use is it for evangelicalism. And I think in the American evangelical scene, I'm not so sure. I guess you could say I'm a little skeptical of its use insofar as how it's being presented. Some of my questions are with CRT is that it's very much tied in with a lot of these other upheaving political movements in our culture right now. Because you have to analytically distinguish a lot of these threads that it just gets jumbled in. For instance, Black Lives Matters, you have this project, you have also Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project, and you have very much many different threads that you sort of lump sum it all together. And so, since the George Floyd riots of last year, which you had, lots of damage created in many cities, in many poor cities, that right there was when the emergence of BLM really became a thing, and then critical race theory sort of dovetailed on it, even though it was a part of academia long ago, since the 70s, but now it's more in the form of the public discourse where everybody knows about it. So there is a knee-jerk reaction to it that I don't know, it would need basically a lot more PR, a lot more better communication. But I think that this notion of CRT, it started off basically on a bad foot for its public presence. First impressions count the most. Well, its first impressions are with massive political upheavals in the American culture. So as far as evangelicalism as a whole, of course, that goes into how we define it and what it means. But global evangelicalism, Latin American evangelicalism outside of the United States, I think that might be another issue too, because a lot of Latin American evangelicalism, it might be a little conservative compared to the more what's the progressivism that's now starting to characterize American style evangelicalism, which is sort of creating that rift between old style evangelicalism and new school, which really takes off from the emergent church and has really evolved into the premier face of progressive evangelicalism. So I think there would be also the problem of trying to communicate CRT with evangelicals outside of the United States, which may skew more towards rejecting it because if it gets identified with Marxist theory, for instance, like the Cuban Americans they voted very conservative during the election because anything that has to do with Che or communism, they just want to get away from. And so there would be perhaps substantial pushback coming from global evangelicalism in this sense. So that's just all I want to add.
Okay, great. All right, and now I'll Alyssa, are you there? Oh, there. Did you?
Yep,
Yeah.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. So let me just say, she can introduce herself, but she is kind of been the spark plug, including designing the logo behind this whole difficult discussions initiative. And so I just want to give her credit for that, for sort of being the kind of inspiration to do a lot of this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Alyssa. I'm a second year MA student at the University of Denver in the Religious Studies department. So I guess what I really wanted to talk about was I read Removing the Stain of Racism in the Southern Baptist Convention. And it talked a lot about the fact that racism in religion began with this notion of original sin. And keeping that in mind, and the fact that Christianity is kind of looking for ways to mitigate and atone for sins, can we look at racism and this concept of critical race theory in the same way, as a way of atoning for that original sin? And I think my question is probably more for Jason than anybody else. But just if we look at this concept that the Southern Baptist Convention is historically rooted in racism and rooted in this idea of original sin, and the evangelical church is primarily white males, can change actually happen within the institution if the institution is the problem?
Yep. Thank you. All right. So Diana Abel, who's, by the way, the assistant editor for the Journal for Culture and Religious Theory.
Yes. Hi, I'm Diana. I'm also a second year master's student with the Religious Studies department. Most of my research on this was just sort of the history of evangelicalism. And so I would like to think I'm well versed in kind of the American history of it and how it's been involved with different aspects of politics and popular media leading up to the huge conflagration that we see today with all of the controversy. And so I really wanted to hear more from Soong-Chan. Yes, sorry. And I really want to hear more about how the progressive thread of evangelicalism kind of adapted to and is analyzing CRT in a positive way, because that's something that I didn't come across in my research. And so, yeah, if we have time, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. Guys, if you duly notes what they want you to talk about, I know that you love to talk. We all love to talk. We're academics. It's why we're in the business. So we get back to that. Thank you, Diana. All right, so I guess next on the list, if I'm just kind of looking, would be Jared Lacey, who's the assistant editor to the new Polis.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jared Lacey. I'm also a second year master's student at the Religious Studies program at DU. So what I wanted to talk about, and in my research, I was looking at sort of the foundations of the concept of race in terms of, slavery, and also certain like Calvinist history to that as well. And so in my reading, I read Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics and Robin Blackburn's The Making of New World Slavery. I won't quote from those extensively, but that's kind of informing what I'm talking about here. So in spite of critical race theory's claim of rejecting racial essentialism, it is largely perceived as essentialist by the media and its many critics. Conservative pundits frequently associate white guilt with the notion of original sin. However, as I mentioned, critical race theory explicitly rejects racial essentialism. It might be said, though, that critical race theory's attempt to radically critique the liberal order falls short on account of what could be understood not as racial essentialism, but an essentializing of racism as the primary factor in Western modernity's system of deciding who is human and who is not, who's worthy of life and who deserves to die. Achille Mbembe calls this system necropolitics. Though, as Robin Blackburn suggests in her book, The Making of New World Slavery, while the concept of race as a central criteria for deciding who is human and who is subhuman may have been somewhat novel to the advent of the modern world, the more important deciding factor may be the commodification of humanity and inhumanity. In other words, it's more the commercial element than the racial element of the slave trade that distinguishes slavery in the modern world from previous examples of slavery. The result is that even though we have seen some great strides in the civil rights movement toward racial equality, as Delgado points out, Delgado from the introduction to critical race theory, these achievements have not succeeded in eliminating what we today commonly refer to as structural racism. So instead of turning towards the kinds of concepts that critical race theory attributes this to, things like microaggression and implicit bias, we need to look beyond racism, perhaps, for the root causes that have made racism possible. Even if we were to succeed in correcting implicit biases and eliminating microaggressions when it comes to race, we would still have those structures that not only make them possible, but might even make them necessary. And so I think in terms of like the question of whether or not critical race theory is the most beneficial tool, I think maybe it is a very useful tool for Christian evangelicalism, because the alternative of what I was looking at in many ways might be much scarier to the Christian evangelical than critical race theory. So we do need something, and I think that critical race theory is a good start.
Great. Thank you. Our next participant is Kev Grain, who's new to the team, but I believe Kev has also had some kind of pastoral experience, and he's part of the editorial team, sort of floats back and forth right now, and has been working very much on kind of doing the research for this area. So Kev?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a first-year master's student out here at the University of Denver on the critical theory track. And so kind of what my thought has been on critical race theory is I think it's been great to sort of alert the evangelical church as to maybe some of the subconscious biases that we have as we do ministry. But one thing that has kind of stuck out that I would love to hear more, if any of you have ministerial experience or just have any thoughts on the idea, is that on a functional level, it seems to me that there is the solution for this racial issue that we seem to have is not, as Martin Luther, would say, that this equality, this in I Have a Dream, it's not equality for all races. Instead, it's almost going to the opposite direction and going into this term of anti-racism and giving some sort of special privilege or attention to minorities in order to atone for past transgressions. Now, as a evangelical myself, I'd say where I sometimes might have a little bit of an issue with this is that it seems to imply that there is some sort of sin that is not covered in the sacrifice of Christ, basically, that Christ covers all a multitude of sins with the exception of the sins of my past generation, these transgressions that they have brought up against minorities in the past, now leading me as an evangelical to have to atone for those sins of the past. Now that becomes problematic because, and within much evangelical Christian theology, Christ covers all sins and we don't have to atone for any of those. And furthermore, throughout the Bible, I mean, there's never really any instance of someone having to atone for a lot of the sins of their forefathers. I mean, one's called to be responsible for their sins of themselves, but you're not or persecuted or punished for the sins of your forefathers. So that's sort of the general issue that I seem to see with critical race theory as it applies on a functional level to the Christian evangelical. So if you guys have any thoughts, I would love to hear more about sort of what you think. Yeah, looks like Scott, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, we got two more responses, and we'll get.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I'd be delighted to address that point whenever the time's appropriate.
It's coming up very quickly. So Rachel Foley, who's all, yes, Rachel, you there?
Hi, I'm Rachel. I studied the historical aspects of critical race theory itself, and it just started in law school, not for me, for the starters of it, Delgado, and I didn't write it down, sorry. And I read the book Critical Race Theory, and it talked about the different it talked about the different laws and the different things that were happening at the time that the law students were looking at and thinking how it was not racially fair. And so I'm really disturbed by what critical race theory has become in the media, and just in the US in general, I guess, because it became politically charged again, probably in spring, summer of 2020, with the George Floyd riots and protests and stuff, and Black Lives Matter being put to the head of the political sphere. And it was never intended to be something like what it is. It wasn't supposed to be a divisive word or anything like that. It was just supposed to be saying that, like, things haven't always been free or fair or equal in the legal system. So I think as far as evangelicalism is concerned, it would behoove Christianity to kind of get behind critical race theory, or at least think of something similar to teach people, to teach America the things that happened in the country that we're ashamed of. And that's really what the word critical race theory is as a stand-in for. It's just like any history that we don't want to look at. And actually, like, the history that we don't want to look at is the history that's kind of most important, and the stuff that's really like going to come back to haunt us. So that's all.
Thank you. And last, simply because his last name begins with a Y, is Suhaib Yunus, who's on our team as well. Suhaib, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First order of business, how do I look? Secondly, I have a problem, and it's called not preparing. However, I'm an improv comedian, so I'll extemporize. So there were two things that I think that were brought up that were really essential. And one was by Dr. Raw, I think, and he mentioned Proxy War. Either you or Dr. Coley. And the other one was by Dr. Alvis, I think, and that had to do with the relationship with CRT to critical theory, or the German thinkers in the post-war period. So I think in the first, to deal with the latter first, I think that as academics, we have an inclination to pull the discussion back into what is more familiar, what's more in our bailiwick, right? What's more in our domain. So we want to make the point or clarify that CRT isn't really a critical theory in itself. However, I think for the conservatives, the genetic link between CRT and critical theory is not in methodology; it's in perspective. And I think that's something that Dr. Alvis was kind of alluding to. And so that, I think, is critical in establishing our position or determining our own position in the discussion, because it's going to simply add another voice to the din if we're trying to force what is ultimately a social discussion about a term that is being used in an effective way, in a colloquial way, rather than a technical way, into a jargonized discussion that really has nothing to do with what people are talking about. So do we want our position to be within the discussion where we're participating, or do we want to pull people into our own discussions where, you know, the halls of the academia, which other people don't want to do, right? But that's going to completely change the dynamics of the conflict. And is that really what we want to do? Second thing is the proxy war, which is related, I think. But you know, what it seems to me is that no one actually cares about CRT fundamentally. It's not about CRT. It's about other things. CRT, or the conflict about CRT, the dynamic of each side in the animus and the antagonism. It's loaded with other feelings of anathematization, of just this general of this tribalist animus that is continually and progressively fulminating, and you know, kind of being sort of exacerbated by, you know, the vagaries of life, and you know, there's questions about whether, you know, what is you know, by design, right? How beneficial is conflict to things like profit? If you look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, you know, where was the division that we see now then, when you had just the 99% against the 1%? If you know, looked at the you know, the photos of the people that were protesting, it was exactly the people that are fighting against each other now, but they were they found themselves bound together by the common purpose and the common feeling of exploitation. So how much of this is kind of distracting from how much of this tribalism is actually distracting from overarching issues that are more fundamental and actually at the root of the things that people are up in arms about in the first place. So those are kind of the things that I had to say about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Shoaib. And now, John, I'm going to turn it over to you for the second hour, which will be, you know, whatever we want to say to whom in response. So now this is where the role of the moderator really comes in.
So I think there were several questions that were asked, and so different professors, if you want to respond, I think each person from Whitestone definitely asked a question. So who would like to jump in? Scott, how about you? I see you on the board. You want to jump in? You wanted to address one, I think, that Rachel mentioned, and if you'd like to address that, it'd be great.
So the question that stood out to me as something that I might fruitfully address was, I believe came from Kev, but maybe there's some connections to others. So to this point about collective guilt or guilt for past sins, et cetera, I see this come up fairly often in conversations with, I guess, among conservative evangelicals. I think it's really important to distinguish guilt on the one hand from owing restitution on the other hand, right? And I'll just start by saying that when the electric company sends me a bill, an electric bill, right? I don't get the bill and say, well, I didn't do anything wrong, right? Or I'm not gonna get out my checkbook and write Jesus paid it all and mail that back in, right? Point being, it's one thing to say that I, by virtue of my membership in a particular group, namely white guys, am guilty for stuff that was done, long before I was born. Now, some people want to press that argument and say that, there is sort of collective guilt that traces back over time and so on. To be honest with you, I don't fully understand that, so I'm not going to address it one way or another. It just doesn't make sense to me, but I certainly don't think that's true. On the other hand, right, it can be the case that I'm not guilty for anything that happened, before my birth, or that I had no agency in. And I can still look around and acknowledge that, like, the median white family has like 1,000% more wealth than the median Black family, and say, well, that didn't just happen, right? There were institutions that were set up to do this. And we are looking at the echoes of those, the reverberations of those policies in the present day. Right now, there may be interesting questions of transitional justice about how exactly we rectify this wrong, but just, I think it's important to make the conceptual distinction between saying, like, there's something that's owed versus, you're guilty of something that, your ancestors did or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, unpack that a little bit more, Dr. Coley. I mean, because it can be a little ambiguous.
Okay, so suppose that my grandfather stole $40,000 from your grandfather. And just for the sake of simplicity, let's say that it was cash. Never mind why your grandfather had $40,000 in cash. Let's suppose it was his legitimately, okay? And my grandfather put that money in a safety deposit box, so it's right there, okay? So my grandfather owes your grandfather $40,000, right? Because he stole it from him. So he owes him. Well, suppose that your grandfather then dies, and leaving his entire estate, again, for the sake of simplicity, to one heir, which is like your dad, okay? Well, that $40,000 debt then passes, the IOU passes from your grandfather to your dad, right?
Well,
When you say that's right. Now, I'm not talking within the context of like, could you actually, would this be actionable in court, right? We're talking like justice, big J justice here, right? Okay.
But what I'm saying though is, and I think we don't want to get lost in it, is you were talking institutional and then you give a very personal application. So
good.
Kind of keep it in the context of institution, because that may help us understand, repayment or whatever that looks like. What does that look like?
Excellent. So it's clear how the debt would transfer from one generation to another, even if there's no wrongdoing by the later generations. That's clear. In this personal case, I'm going to bring it to institutions now, right? But as long as we're clear on that point. Okay, great. So the Federal Housing Administration in 1934, right? From 1934 to 1968. 1968 wasn't that long ago. Bob Dylan was almost 40. That guy's still cutting albums, right? I haven't heard them. I don't know if they're any good, but he's still putting them out there. Okay, so the Federal Housing Administration, as a matter of law, it's not just that it permitted racial discrimination in housing, right? It mandated racial discrimination in housing. Yeah. So people of color were effectively barred from owning desirable real estate. And the book Color of Law goes into this in great detail. So I won't reiterate, all the details there, but we're all broadly familiar with redlining. Well, as it turns out, during the span of time when basically the US government created the white middle class through a program of mortgage insurance that made it possible for banks to lend money to folks buying houses in what are the suburbs, right? None of that would have been possible had it not been underwritten by everyone, right? So everyone, all Americans are paying into this system, this insurance system that subsidizes the purchase of real estate, which then increases in value by about $200,000, like the median piece of property, just by living in a home and making your mortgage payment, you would have gotten about $200,000 richer from, say, the 1940s to the end of the 1960s, right? That's like $200,000 that the US government just gave to, white middle class families. And the number one way that Americans accumulate and transfer wealth from one generation to the next is through home equity. I don't care what Dave Ramsey says. Okay. Is it possible to just save up your money and get rich? Maybe, but nobody does that. You die and and of course, we're not talking about the Waltons, right? They've got, hedge funds or whatever. No, just like 90% of Americans transfer wealth from one generation to the next, do it through home equity, and that's it. So,
right. So again, the retribution, the justice that needs to take place, is that at the governmental level, where we need to, because that's an institution that probably you and I can't impact.
So I think the least provocative way to frame it is to say the US government misallocated these funds and the US government needs to make restitution.
Okay. And so is restitution, is that a paycheck?
There are different proposals. I think Rothstein in the Color of Law gives an interesting proposal. The government buys real estate in certain neighborhoods as it becomes available on the free market, and then sells it to people of color at the rate adjusted for inflation at the price that it would have been available when the house was built.
Okay.
And who picks up the tab for that? Well, you could say you draw it out of taxes. You could set up a program where people are free to donate and it would be tax deductible. There would be a nice symmetry in that in the mortgage interest deduction that has been available to some folks and not others. There are various proposals. As I say, there are interesting questions of transitional justice about how exactly you do this, but it's important to note there's nothing like antithetic to Christianity or antithetic to the message of forgiveness about saying a debt is owed and it needs to be paid.
No, I think you make a great point. But again, I think where some Christians kind of muddy the waters is, you need to feel personal guilt for an institutional offense. And then I think that's where it kind of runs awry. So the question that was asked of, Dr. Alva or whatever, you want to answer that question? So it's a different one. We're kind of on that. We'll come back to it in case anybody wants to comment. But I think it would be a good opportunity. We want to try to answer some of the questions that were posed. So are you with us,
Yeah.
Germany?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm with you. Yeah, so the question I believe maybe you're referencing is the one from Melissa. And that was a very provocative question about the corrupt institutions, namely the Southern Baptist Convention. And I think maybe to summarize the question, is change possible in corrupt institutions? What can be done in these corrupt institutions? So Alyssa was mentioning quite rightly the takeover of white males. There's obviously a current purge. If you pay much attention to the news, current purge taking place of leadership in SBC. They had their big meeting not that long ago this year. Was it maybe 5 months ago. And some of the symptoms of the problems that we're seeing, critical race theory being one of the cowbells to the problems of these symptoms. We're hearing those bells ring much louder now. Now, to try to address that question, is change possible in corrupt institutions? I mean, to try to answer that question, if I were a scholar of critical race theory, which I do not see myself as being one of those, I would say yes, change is possible. But then the question becomes where specifically should we place our optimism in that change?
Mm.
So in certain ways, you also see a certain optimistic theological anthropology of those who are in the SBC and those who hold to a more conservative, say Baptist theology, a very highly positive, optimistic theological anthropology, which is not just, Jesus saves you, save you from your sins, and you're a changed person, and you can do anything. Everything's possible. It's not just that. It's actually a real possibility of being able to receive the gospel and to be able to receive it and then to change. So it's not just that God does the changing, does the salvific work, so to speak, but that the person also is able to change in cooperation, in participation with God. So that's one way of seeing the optimism. Where is the optimism placed? But again, back to the point of critical race theory, the optimism of critical race theory, and some of those roots that I mentioned earlier of Enlightenment philosophy from Kant and others. It's a full 100% belief in the human project, in the possibility that humans can change. They need guardrails, but they can change. And one of the ways to do that critical race theory perceives and attempts to implement, especially institutional governmental level, which is quite different from the ecclesial governmental level, so to speak. But one of the ways to do that is to set up guardrails within the institutions so that way powers can be limited. Domination, tyranny, these different forms of nasty authority can be limited. So that way, not just others have voices, but that others are able to speak up when there's a certain social wrong that's going on. So Alyssa, I'm trying to answer your question. I'm kind of spinning around here. I'd say for critical race theorists, change is possible, even though the critical race theorists would look at an institution like the Southern Baptist Convention and often gaffe and not know what to do with it and would be very frustrated with it. I think they would still deep down in their heart of hearts say change is possible. It's just a question of where and how and to what degree is that optimism placed.
So, Jason, if you would unpack maybe 2 or 3, maybe a little bit more practical way that change is possible. I mean, that's nice. It's kind of can be a little slogan, but what are 2 or 3 ways, and you said it's not domination, that's kind of theoretical. What would be practical ways that you could maybe advocate for change?
Well, I tried to address the 3 points earlier. In what ways critical race theory?
I want to have one too, Dickie.
You can have both of these. How about that? Why don't you take them into your bedroom? Yeah, the 3 ways that critical race theory can be helpful for the church. And I would not presume to act as if I have a voice in the political arena. First of all, in the German context or in the American context. So I don't have much to say about those institutions and the changing of those institutions, but I would say as someone who's been a part of Christian churches, these are places where I do believe I've had some kind of voice. I would say those three. I would come back to those 3 points: reaching out, reaching in, reaching up. So
Why is
critical
it
race
not
theory,
getting in there?
critical
Why
race
is
theory
not
can
getting
be
in
helpful.
there?
That's a good question. Stick it in your ears. Take it to mom really quick. Show her. Critical race theory can help us develop solidarity against division. It can help us for institutional investigation, and it can help us consider missional engagement in a new and different way. Those things are possible. And it sounds in certain ways a little abstract and a little bit ethereal, a little bit too cheap.
Why
perhaps,
is he not
and I think others
speaking?
can critique it.
Why is he not?
I'd say that's my main position.
Why is he not speaking?
Maybe you'll hear him talk in a second.
Do you, Alyssa, do you feel like that was answered for you, the question?
I do. I think so. My perspective was a kind of less of the theological perspective and more of, I guess, maybe a political social perspective, especially through the lens of something like colonialism, where, you know, how can a group of people who are the root of the problem also be the ones then to solve that problem? But I think coming from a theological perspective, I think that definitely answers the question.
Okay. Is it, you know, again, that's a legitimate question that you gave. Well, let's go to the next person. Diana had a question, and I can't, Diana, who did you direct your question to, please?
I wanted to hear more from Dr. Ra about the progressive movement and how they are kind of looking at CRT in the positive light, and how they are wrestling with all of these ideas and imminent changes.
There you go, Dr. Ra.
Sure. I mean, the progressive thread, if you look at the kind of the previous generation that emerges in the 1970s with the Chicago Declaration and with publications like Sojourners, institutions like ESA, CCDA, et cetera, that generation, you know, they're now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. You get like Sojourners responding affirmatively around critical race theory. You get, you know, that a lot of that community now identify as ex-evangelical in many places as well. But what's interesting is evangelicals of color who identify, and I would fall into this camp, evangelicals of color who identify more with the progressive evangelical school. You know, a lot of it has been, we've had to defend ourselves constantly with this kind of like, you're a CRT, you're a Marxist, you're, you know, all these kind of name calling, straw man argument that's come up before, that kind of getting lumped into this. And some of my African-American colleagues who are, I would consider to be progressive evangelicals, but also staunchly evangelicals, but more social political progressives, they would say, look, you know, these ideas that you're accusing me of, I didn't get them from CRT. I got them from the Bible, or I got them from my church history. Having been part of the Black church for, you know, all my life, these ideas about, you know, oppression and social structural issues, I never had to read a book by CRT. I just lived my life in the Black church, or I, you know, just lived my life as a Black man or a Black woman. So that's where particularly progressive evangelicals of color are saying, I don't know why, and I did a kind of a joke meme on Facebook, and I posted, I had just ordered from Amazon about 7 months ago 2 key books on critical race theory, and I said, you know, I've been accused of this. I just want to know what I'm being accused of. So I bought these 2 books to read so I can know what I'm being accused of. So that's where some of that response has been, you know, in many cases, we do understand critical race theory, but a lot of our sourcing on this, of how we understand race and racial dynamics, is really coming from, for us, scripture, theology, our heritage and our story. So I can give you some names of individuals who, mainly through social media, there are a couple of works by like Nelson Cartagena at Wheaton College, who has done a number of interviews. He's actually a critical race theorist, but he also teaches at an evangelical school. Jeff Liu and Robert Chow Romero, again, kind of 2 Asians, one Asian, one Latino Asian, who are evangelicals of color, who are currently writing a book on kind of an evangelical response to critical race theory in a more favorable light. So these are kind of evangelicals who are progressive social politically, but if you were to examine their kind of theology, you would find that they're more on the conservative end in terms of their theology and their affiliations, Wheaton College, InnoVarsity, et cetera. Their affiliations are kind of evangelical. But I do want to kind of add a comment to what was said a little bit earlier, because Dr. Coley, I love your comments about this distinction between this individual understanding and this kind of social structural understanding. And this is a problem, I would argue, theologically. And this is a theologically rooted problem, because what I've written about is that American evangelical theology is so hyper individualistic. It stops looking like the Bible and it starts looking like kind of the society as a whole, which is hyper individualistic. And so even the word guilt, I've said in a number of settings, I don't like the phrase white guilt because it is not sufficient, not because it's, it makes me upset or anything like that. It's not sufficient. It's an inadequate term, because guilt is the way I would understand the word guilt is a individualistic kind of Western concept of how one feels when an individual does something wrong. And so to me, white guilt, I don't use that phrase not because it offends people, but because it's not strong enough. It's not sufficient. What CRT actually does is it actually raises the possibility not of white guilt, but I would argue white shame, and the differentiation between guilt and shame culture. Guilt is you feel bad about something you've done, and therefore you go to God and confess that and get healing and salvation from God. That's very much an American evangelical faith. I feel bad about using the N-word 20 years ago, so I'm going to do something now to make up for it. I'm going to take the King holiday off and go golfing. That's my act of retribution as an individual to make up for my white guilt. Shame, on the other hand, is more, and this is kind of an Asian cultural dynamic that I grew up in. It's not just you feel bad about something you've done, you feel bad about your setting. You feel bad about your identity, which is a very different theological starting point. And, as a theologian, I would look at that and say, well, the Bible is really more about shame than it is about guilt, that our identity is brokenness and sinfulness, not just our individual actions. And so if we start talking about white shame, now we've got a whole different level. And that's the problem with CRT for evangelicals. It's not an easy way out. Guilt is an easy way out to say, okay, I feel guilty about being white, and therefore I'm going to change. I feel guilty about something I did as an individual, therefore I'm going to do a positive action now. Versus white shame is, no, my community, my society, I've participated in, my identity, who I am, there is a shame to that because there's a brokenness there. And that is not so easily resolved. And our white American evangelical theology, as Ken was mentioning, doesn't have the parameters, the vocabulary to understand this type of brokenness and sinfulness.
Very good.
Can I piggyback on that a little bit?
Just for about 2 minutes, Scott, okay?
Won't even take that long.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
I think that there is total absence of an understanding of the moral salience of institutions among evangelicals. The morality is the sort of moral horizon is tethered to individual piety. Mm-hmm. That's it. And there's something here that it may be obvious. I don't know. When I first started paying attention to these conversations, I noticed people talking about how justice is somehow antithetic to Christianity. And I thought, well, they're just lying. Like, that's in bad faith. And I realized, like, they actually believe this. And I think the fundamental divide that we're seeing is between people who see morality as fundamentally a matter of certain kinds of social hierarchy and authority and submission, versus those who see morality as a matter of objective truth about what people deserve and what we owe to each other as human beings. And I actually do think that those who see morality, and there's all sorts of things we could say about ideology and legitimizing myths and how this gets built into the gospel that is preached among those who just preach the gospel, right? But the folks on the hierarchy side, like, they don't want justice. They really can't get down with CRT because For them, the hierarchy is legitimate, and that's as it should be. I'm not one of those, in case that's
very good.
not
Jason,
obvious.
Jason, go ahead and add to that, please.
Yeah, it's awesome. I want to follow with that view, Scott and Soong-Chan, this view of the problem of autonomy versus, say, like heteronomy that we see, especially in more right-leaning churches, evangelical-leaning churches. I would also add, though, that many of these churches have a very strong authoritative structure. I recently checked out a book by Owen Strachan. If you're looking for an excellent just symptom of white guilt, white shame and white guilt, as you mentioned so excellently, Soong-Chan, check out this book because it is a perfect picture of how the problem is not racism. The problem is the feelings of being pointed at as flawed, as humanly flawed. And that's something we don't like to experience. But anyway, Strahan, in his book, he references this matter of church authority. The problem is not for him individuals holding to these beliefs. The problem is when authority members of these churches, of these ecclesial communities, starts to hold these beliefs, because that starts to corrupt the flock, so to speak. So you do have this institutional, big, overarching, even bigger perhaps, institutional perspective, maybe even bigger than critical race theory could ever imagine or dream of, in that social sense. But it's just I would say, a misplaced kind of authority structure.
Okay, very, very well. We're going to get to Jared's question here in a second, but I think, Scott, I think another thing theologically that happens, a lot of evangelicals believe the things of this world, government, the social structures are of the enemy. It's a lost cause. The only thing that's really redeemable is the individual, and that adds to this bifurcation of the individual or the autonomous versus the heteronomous, concept. But I think you're right. The institutional thing needs to be evaluated from a theological lens. Going back to Dr. Ra's comments, I think it's just brilliant and insightful. The whole notion of shame is a really good concept. Now, with that in mind, Jared, go ahead and restate your question. And who was it for?
It wasn't really for anybody specifically, I guess.
Lay it out.
So it's, I guess, within evangelicalism, if we eliminate the elements of racial othering, are there not still like more fundamental elements of othering that would still need to be addressed? It's not necessarily inherent to Christianity, but inherent to the Christian church in the modern world.
Dr. Ra, do you have anything that you'd like to say on that?
Sure, and I mentioned this in some of the vocabulary I was saying in my opening remarks about, why am I blanking on this, anthropologist, Christian anthropologist who taught at Fuller for many years, Paul Hebert, who talks about the distinction between bounded set and centered set. And then I've used the term truth pursued and truth possessed. And so this is most notable in the fundamentalist thread, but also very evident in the Reformed and Pentecostal threads as well, and therefore shapes the neo-evangelical thread. What you see, and this is and I would argue there's kind of a Western, philosophical argument to this, which is the idea there are insiders and there are outsiders. There is a bounded set within which we count as those inside, and there is something outside of that. So for me as a professor of evangelism, when I look at the threads of how evangelism has been viewed, for example, like the doctrine of discovery, what you saw was we can take Africans as slaves, we can conquer the new world and kind of wipe out the native civilizations because this is our act of evangelism, because we are the insiders and they are the outsiders. We are made in the image of God and they are not. We are imbued by the Spirit of God to go and be the light and salt into the world, and these others are not. So this concept of otherness, it is most evident, I think, in our society right now around the issue of race. But it's also evident, obviously, around issues of gender and the exclusion of women in leadership in many of these kind of more conservative circles. It's and when we talk about race, it's not just African Americans. You see this in the historical Native American treatment, and obviously the images that we've seen recently on the border towards Haitians, but also towards South Americans and Latin Americans and Central Americans. These narratives replay over and over again. The Japanese internment, Chinese Exclusion Act. These are all aspects of othering. The reason, and this is speculation on my part, but there's some evidence here, that white American evangelicalism has gotten to the point that it is today, and maybe to the level of success or mixed results about where they've arrived, is that it's played that game really well. It's played the game of insider outsider really, really well, to such an extent that even those who are on the outside who've been excluded, when they're invited into the inside of white evangelicalism, there's an embracing of that. And I'm not going to name names, but I've kind of fallen into that trap myself, where, the insider evangelical, by going to the evangelical institutions of the seminaries and the parachurch organization and the denominations, evangelicals of color can be invited in. But as Willie Jennings points out, salvific viability for many Western Christians is based upon one's approximation of whiteness. And so that othering takes on another level when you can bring in folks to your inside group, but then you're also bringing in and then those are the voices you hear. These are the voices that agree with you. Oh, CRT is evil. And it could be a Black voice that says that. Oh, we got to stop immigration. It could be a Latino voice that says that. So that insider outsider has been demarcated by race very frequently, but there is also we'll accept you into the inside, and there's the pressure as long as you kind of play by these rules.
Yeah, Joshua, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? Thank you, Dr. Rock.
Yes. Yes. I guess. I don't disagree with Soong-Chan on this issue. I think my experience has been this: is that bottom line, I think this insider-outsider issue, in my opinion, it seems to be less oftentimes about race than it is the idea. And the reason why I say this is because your skin color matters less if you disagree, right? And so you have this epithet called Uncle Tom, right? And immediately is thrown out the minute if you're of the same color but of a different opinion, it's thrown out there, right? I don't know if there's I guess Uncle Tom just goes to all the races, but I don't know what it is particularly as a Mexican American. And so that is a very I guess it just strikes me as its skin color is convenient when it suits you, but when it doesn't suit you, then it's meaningless. And so I think that tends to be the rub in dissenters of color that have contrarian opinion, right? And so then what it becomes more about the idea than the color of the skin. So that's all I want to add.
Okay.
Can
And
I say something here, John? Can I
sure
say something?
Sure, Professor.
Because some of these people that were our MA students, they were reading some literature that I gave them, and I go by Jared, because Jared had a very interesting point that I think is kind of getting slighted right here. And before I go into say that there's one thing that I think is lacking in all these conversations, even at the academic level, is a sufficient understanding of the nuances and the historical context in which these issues have arisen. I won't go into the genealogy of critical race theory with Jason already went over and so forth. But the term critical race theory all of a sudden gets thrown out as it was this kind of object. We all sort of know what it talks about when it becomes a marker. And I want to use this term marker because it's a sociological term. Jared talked about the African critical theorist. That's what he is. And he's very well known in our field. And in fact, I think Jason is having a project this year that involves him. Very, very insightful thinker. He's a philosopher, he's academic, but very insightful. And one of Mbembe's, Akili Mbembe, that's his name, one of Mbembe's points that he makes in not only necropolitics, but in a later book, which is called The Critique of Black Reason, is that the relationship between religion and outsiderness and race historically, particularly in the 17th century, because of the necessity of commodifying people, that is African slaves. I mean, it wasn't the fact that African slaves were brought to America just simply because white people, were prejudiced. They didn't really have an idea. It was like you had to have, we'd already wiped out, the Native American population, primarily through disease, but also through exploitation and what was essentially genocide. And so to satisfy, and the Underwood really talks about how this worked in the 17th century. So to satisfy the growing consumer demand for two commodities, tobacco and sugar, and later coffee, all which were grown best within the Caribbean, not in North America so much within the Caribbean, you had to have massive levies of cheap or free labor. And it was that economic necessity that forced the, you might say, not only the slave system, but also the Africanization, of which slaves already existed in Africa. And a lot of this had to do with the distinction that was between Muslims and infidels who had penetrated into Africa. And what Mbembe points out is that the marker, you're religiously different, whether you're an infidel from a Muslim point of view or you're a pagan from a Christian point of view. And that idea, and I know Soong-Chan mentioned the fact that we're all made in the image of God, but the idea in the 17th century, which really goes back in many ways to Constantinian Christianity, this kind of otherness, is that we're going to preach the gospel. If you don't accept it, then that's your fault. So therefore, you're not Christian, you're not human. In other words, you've got to be Christian in the formal sense of having gone through the sacraments, or even going down to the altar in the modern sense, to be human. So what Mbembe points out, and other writers like this have done this as well, so the marker, which was essentially a religious marker, now because of the commodification, the necessity of commodification, people it becomes a racial marker, and that racial marker becomes in itself a kind of essentialist property that becomes part of the cognitive framework, the deep framework in which people are understood, and so forth. And these systems have been in place because of that kind of differentiation. We need to look at Jim Crow and understand, how it was more than just discrimination. It was the creation of a whole perceptual and cognitive system. And we do that today, ironically, over critical race theory. I think the point that Josh just made about how you're in the club or you're not. You may be a different color skin, but you don't have the right attitudes. Therefore, you're not a real Black person, or you're not a real Asian, and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of contradictions here. Everybody said, well, it was about the white Trumpists and evangelicals versus, the world and people of color. Well, statistically, that's not true at all. And if one wants to face those kind of problems and contradictions, you really need to come to the talk on Tuesday by Professor Kaufman, because he's going to lay out data and statistics to show how people's attitudes, which we call racial, really have to do a lot with different kind of markers and perceptions and orientations that aren't inherently or initially racial. But race becomes a kind of universal marker to kind of make it easy to sort. And that's what I think is missing in all these conversations. How are we doing this sorting process? Okay, so that's all I have to say about that.
Oh, that was excellent. Thanks. Hey, I did want to ask Suhab, did you want to direct a question to anyone? You had some comments, and I didn't know if you maybe had a question.
No, I didn't really have a direct question. It's more kind of general points.
Yeah, and again, well taken, well spoken, so good job. But did you have anything out of that that you would like to, kind of vet out a little bit more?
Carl said a lot of what I wanted to get addressed. The idea that so the history of racism in America is in large part a chapter of the history of economics, and we have to see things in the broader context if we're gonna talk about historicity, which a lot of this is about, right? So I guess if I had a question, it would just be, or if I could condense what I said earlier into two questions. One would be, I guess, I think it was Dr. Ra who mentioned the proxy war, or maybe I'm getting that wrong, but whoever did, maybe speak to how the conflict can be perceived as sort of red herring deployed by tribalism. And the other question I would ask to maybe Dr. Alvis is the issue of communication and our own position. How do you see kind of trying to frame the debate and catch everybody's different terms and definitions, corresponding to our own kind of self-determined position as messianic figures descending from the Ivory Coast to kind of arbitrate what's going on.
So was it you, Dr. Ra, that spoke of the proxy war?
I think it was actually Dr. Coley, but similar language I've used is straw man, and we talked about that as well, where you're kind of creating a straw man, and you've actually, and that's a pretty accurate description of what's happening. You lump everything into this word, and it doesn't really mean what it means anymore. So if I talk to people who are kind of antagonistic to critical race theory, and I ask them, well, what do you think it actually is? Most will not be able to answer that question. So this is part of the dynamics of a culture war, where things around like cognitive theory, which is the embodied experience of the narrative and language is more powerful than actually what it might actually, the facts themselves. And this is and I actually, when I originally got the invitation, I thought this was for this group. There's some work by the Harvard negotiating group called Difficult Conversations. And one of the things they identify is that there are 3 levels of communication: facts, feelings, and identity. And I think what happened in a proxy war is that facts don't matter, feeling matters, but at the end of it, it's like you're assaulting my identity. And so all of CRT kind of gets wrapped up in this identity. As a Christian, not just as a white person, as a Christian, I feel offended. So that's, I think, a lot of that kind of proxy war language, and also kind of putting everything into this straw man and then saying, we can beat this thing because, we made it into this kind of proxy for what it represents, the evil that is already in our society.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And again, the elucidation of the straw man. Now let's go to Dr. Coley. Would you like to talk on the proxy war and unpack that a little bit more for us?
So we've gotten into, I think, some really sort of higher order questions about ideology and myths of legitimizing the social hierarchy. When it comes to the sense in which CRT is a proxy war, I'm afraid it's the particulars are a lot less interesting than some of the other stuff we're talking about, because it's so convoluted that it's confusing when you first encounter it, right? So here's the formula. Some critical race theorists say some things that are provocative, right? And so folks will go and find provocative quotes from some critical race theorists and say, look, this is critical race theory. Okay, so first of all, that's bizarre, right? I mean, we're all academics here. It's like, and I'm a philosopher. You could go find something weird that a philosopher says, hey, this is philosophy. Like, what? No, not at all. Okay, so that's step one. You find some provocative things. Look, this is critical race theory. And then you just slap that label on discussions around race. And, you know, it's or Marxism or cultural Marxism or whatever. Although the mention of Marxism, I'm coming to find there is a kernel of truth to the, at least in the minds of those who make this kind of move. If you think that life is about hierarchy and submission to authority, this is where you see racism and misogyny kind of come together, right? If you think that that's what morality is really about, then you might think that any threats to that hierarchy that might have kind of a leveling effect is in some sense Marxist. And I mean, there's a history there, right? During the Cold War where the Soviets were really sort of pointing to the US and saying, look, they claim to be this free society, but look at how they treat women and look at how they treat people of color. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole history there, but yeah, I mean, there's some of these folks do seem to think that any kind of push for justice or equity is in some sense Marxist. But yeah, I mean, I'm afraid it's just convoluted thinking with respect to how CRT is caricatured and then sort of packaged up and dismissed.
Very good. Thank you.
Can I tell a kind of a funny personal story about what Scott just said, which is that a few months ago, I gave a talk at an African-American church that was attempting to do some healing between Black and Asian communities on the heels of the Stop AAPI movement. And so I did like a 5-minute talk there, a sermon. And somebody, I think that he was called like wokepreacher.com or something, who's kind of antagonistic to this whole movement around being woke. Which is so interesting because the Bible actually says, arise, awake, O sleeper. And now we've got folks who are saying, don't be awake, even though that's what the Bible actually tells us to do. So anyway, this person took this clip. And of course, you know, YouTube metrics, the picture that they froze on is at a moment where it looks like I'm screaming at people. And so you have this really angry looking Asian guy screaming at the audience, and that's where it froze on. And of course, that's what gets projected. So like you were saying, they take either one snippet or even just a frozen face where I look really angry and say, hey, look, this is an angry Asian man who hates white people. So that does happen. I mean, it's not just a speculation of like taking snippets here and there and saying this is what they represent. I personally have seen that actually happen.
Okay, very good. Thanks for that. Sorry that happened, but thanks for giving us that insight. Alyssa or Diana, do you have any other questions? Anything that you'd like to unpack additionally?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, Alyssa, you're good. How about you, Diana?
Not off the top of my head. I had like a half-baked idea that I still haven't been able to form into a question. And that's how evangelicals would reconcile the idea that most of their church activities are based on missionary work, and missionary work is more often than not tied with racist undertones. And so I've been trying to make that into a question, but I can't figure out how to do it.
Well, let's do this. For those of you that spoke, which is like Dr. Coley, Dr. Ra, you know, those that were kind of asked to do a little thing. Why don't you think, and I'm trying to stall a little time for you, come up with, you get about 1 minute to just kind of give us some practical, 1 or 2 practical things that we could take away, people that watch this could take away from this going, right? How do we move in a direction that is helpful, healthy, and engaging? We've talked about kind of the antithesis and, you know, so how do we kind of bring it all together? So let's go ahead and start. We're going to start with you, Dr. Ra, in a second, and we're going to ask you for 1 or 2 practical ways that we could move forward. Again, we're going to give you about a minute or 2 because our time is quickly coming to an end. And then we're going to go to Dr. Coley, and then we're going to go to Dr. Alvis, and we'll just kind of work through that. Then we'll go to Joshua. We'll do that. Just some practical things that you could give to us. With that in mind, Dr. Ra, you're on.
Well, my area is in the area of practical theology, but I got to be honest, I'm a little stumped about how this could work out. I will say that it's maybe a typical way for everything. When you embody something that counters what someone has so deeply believed, that's actually one of the kind of the counters to it. So folks who have so deeply embodied this kind of antagonism and hatred and just kind of this knee-jerk reaction against all of these things, if we're in a community and if we're in a relationship that shows and demonstrates something else, demonstrates a counter to that, a healthy community, a reconciled community, a justice community, that to me is one of the counters, in that we are actually visibly, visually embodying what Christ had intended, and it seems to counter the messages that they've heard. That's not very practical, but I think it's one of the more impactful ways.
Actually, I think it is very practical. Embody change, if you want to not just talk about it, but live it, and then also connect with potentially a group that really is addressing a holistic, healthy view of justice. So that's very practical. Thank you for that. Dr. Coley, you're up.
Well, I teach philosophy, so I don't even pretend to be practical.
Try.
I do want to say something about Diana's point, though, about mission. So interestingly enough, right, the Southern Baptist Convention started because of a division over this question, division with other Baptists over the question of whether or not someone who held slaves could be a missionary. And of course, if your thinking on the matter is such that you see these human hierarchies as an expression of God's design rather than a fact of human iniquity, then you see nothing wrong with enslaving people and, going off to some other continent and preaching to people who look just like the people you've enslaved, the gospel. I mean, it's a feature. It's not a bug. That's part of what makes a lot of this confusing. We're having different conversations, right? The gospel that some people are preaching has fully integrated these toxic things to do with race. Practically, I'll just speak. Oh, sorry.
Just give us one thing.
Right. Yeah. So I'll just speak from my own experience. I found that a lot of the Hebrew Bible made basically no sense to me until I realized that it's about justice.
Mm-hmm.
And then it all just clicked. It's like, wow, that's why God's mad. I mean, idolatry, yes, but a close second. And often the idolatry involves issues of justice, right? Once you realize that the Hebrew scriptures are about justice, and a lot of the law is about justice, institutional justice, it just makes sense. And then you go back and you read the Exodus narrative, for me, like as a white guy, and I'm like, oh, I'm not the Israelites in this story. Of course, it's dangerous to try to think that you map neatly onto any of the categories, right? But I'm insofar as I map onto any of the groups, like I'm the Egyptians. So practically speaking, I think that reading the Old Testament with justice in view can be a life-changing. Sorry, the Hebrew scriptures with justice in view can be a life-changing experience.
Okay, that's practical. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Alvis, what do you have for us?
Well, I'm an even more complicated postmodern philosopher, so anything practical. Scott was a real practical philosopher just now, everything he just said. It's hard for me to come up with anything.
But you're also a churchman. Come on, man. You came up with 3 points in the sermon. Come on, man.
Come on. Okay. Well, okay. I've got multiple identities. I think that maybe that's the point then to move forward here. Develop more discussion on multiple identities. One thing that really, the bee in my bonnet when I hear people talk about critical race theory, let's say as a particular worldview, for example, it drives me insane. As if it's some cohesive, specific worldview, or as if evangelicalism is one specific, cohesive worldview. We're talking about major movements. I mean, we all participate in various language games, depending upon our circumstance. If I'm playing baseball, we all agree on the rules of baseball when we play. That's part of the game. I participate in secular institutions just as much as my brothers and sisters in the US participate in secular institutions. Does that make me a secular follower of secular ideology? In some cases, maybe yes. In many cases, no. So I think that's one way to lower the temperature in the room, is to get away from this worldview perspective, and to try to see it as ways to enter dialogue with brothers and sisters and people, human beings who have very similar interests as we do towards mishpat and justice, as Scott just mentioned. Right, that's probably where I would go.
That'll work. How about you, Joshua? Dr. Ramos, I'm not sure if you're a doctor, I'm not quite sure. So if you have something practical, one or two practical things, what do you got for us?
Sure thing, John. Well, I dovetail on everybody else's analysis. I'm just a theorist. It's like, what, practicality, but except for Soong-Chan, right? He did practical theology. I just, like I'm more of a, I guess I position myself as more of a critic, but I am a don't throw the baby out the bathwater kind of guy too. And I think this is where I tend to have to check myself, because you guys are right. The Bible is about justice, right? And I think a lot of the bathwater, I think, needs to be flushed out, but we still have to keep that precious pearl of the biblical idea of justice. And whether or not it's been adopted by Marxists or whatever, we still have the commands of Christ, because at the the final judgment, it's like, the water, the visiting the sick, those, I was a stranger, did not welcome me. So how do we fulfill those commands of Christ, but without, necessarily getting tangled with like celebrityism and all of the noise on Twitter and the egos and, because there is a lot of that. And I think that just sort of clouds the views. And so I think that's what it is. You just have to kind of pull back and try to, lower the temperature a bit, as Jason said. And so basically keep the baby, but maybe flush out the bathwater. Okay, there it is.
Okay, very good. So what I hear from you all is...
He is Dr. Ramos, by the way.
Yeah, Dr. Ramos, my apologies. Yeah, so what I hear is embodiment needs to be not only personal, but a communal, just change. You take another look at the Hebrew Bible, i.e. the Old Testament, however you want to view it, through the lens of justice, which, by the way, is an excellent insight. I've done that. It's profound. Develop more discussions with differing voices from our counterpart in Germany. That's excellent. And so thank you very much. And Rachel, so we'll see you later. And then, just embrace a biblical view of justice. What does that look like? Not only in the Hebrew scriptures, but also in the New Testament. What does that look like? And so I think there's some real practical things to say. Dr. Rashke, would you like to wrap us up? We've got a few minutes left.
Yeah, well, you don't want to offer the invitation. Do you have anything to say? Because you know the answer to that. But we only got 2 more minutes. So I would say that the practical thing is, if we're going to use, of course, I'm speaking as a professor, if we're going to throw around terms, let's see if we can understand the origins of the terms. There is I use the term genealogy, which means we kind of trace the process by which something happened, and a lot of these memes or these stereotypes that are taught, like all stereotypes, they have some kind of basis in history or human interaction, but they take out a life of their own. They metastasize and they become used as kind of ideological clubs. They're weaponized, so to speak. And that's what's happened. Of course, social media has a lot to do with it. The fact is, it used to be that only people who, quote, were authorized to say things, I'm using that in broad sense, usually got the voice. Now with social media, anybody can say anything. That's good or bad because it makes it more democratic, participatory. It makes it bad because, essentially those kind of easy metaphors and lazy ways of thinking, kind of take hold. There's, I would say, actually read the books, read what people say. There's a little book out there that somebody asked me about earlier today. It's called Critical Race Theory, a very short introduction. So I mean, it's not the best book, I don't think, but it'll help you understand what the debates really are. For example, the Marxist turn in critical race theory, if that's such a, there's a guy named Charles Mills who wrote a book called From Class to Race, and he really was the one that turned the discussions in critical race theory that way, but he was not, in the sense, representative of all critical race theorists. So we know just that all people of all kind of ethnic categorization are not all the same, including white people. So, you know, all critical race theorists are not the same. Inform yourself. Basically, be willing to be transformed through the experience of nuance, which, I think should go out to us all. That being said, we are out of time, and I want to let everybody know, I encourage you to come to the event on Tuesday at this particular time, when we'll have the critical conversation with Eric Kaufman, Dr. Kaufman, and his book White Shift. It's been a very influential and, of course, controversial books because he's not a theorist in that sense. He's a demographer. He's fact-driven, and he has a certain perspective, and it may not seem right to some people, but I think he does a very good job of arguing what he has to say. I know it was Josh who introduced me to him in the first place, because Josh worked with him at an institute, a research institute there in Vienna. So we need. That's one of the other arguments you hear a lot is that, well, this is all about American issues. And yes, I mean, the question of race is important. That was the title of the kind of tag here. Let's get real about race. Getting real means let's really dig down. Let's hear what the different positions are, and let's see what kind of facts we can really dig out. So I encourage you all to continue this conversation. If you're talking about consumerism, get away from this kind of spectator role. Is this going to entertain me or not? And you can learn more. Read books, read articles. And so that will be Tuesday, the 28th. And next month, believe it or not, and you'll get announcements about that because you're on our list, we're going to be talking about another hot button issue in the same kind of modality, and it's abortion. So this is a difficult discussion, and it won't be our last. So thank you all. And we have you on our mailing list, and we'll let you know when the video of this is available.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Carl.
Yeah.